civil rights by definition, what do you think they are? I don't know a technical definition, the perfect definition for civil rights. But if it were me, my definition for civil rights, and since I'm the teacher, they're going to be your definition for civil rights, is going to be the political, you writing? The political, social, and economic rights granted to each citizen, underline each citizen, by the Constitution. The end-all, be-all Constitution of the United States of America. That is civil rights. And anything that denies me my civil rights oftentimes has to be fought against. And so with that, there is going to be a ton of topics of civil rights coming into play. There always has been since the beginning of American history. Abigail Adams to Frederick Douglass to, Alice Paul in the 19th Amendment to, all of this stuff that is going to be calling for civil rights. But there is definitely going to be the civil rights movement that pops up in the 50s and 60s. So let's go ahead and confirm and, of course, talk about the biggest leader, the leader of civil disobedience, okay? Civil disobedience, Mr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, here's the deal. We already talked about the emergence of King with the Montgomery bus boycott and Rosa Parks, right? We talked about the NAACP and Brown versus Board of Education. We talked about the Little Rock Nine. We've talked a lot about this. The sit-ins are starting, of course, in the South. But all this civil disobedience, by definition, civil disobedience, remember, is passive resistance. It is literally came from Gandhi. That'd be a good quiz question. Civil disobedience literally comes from Gandhi. The act of basically disobeying, but doing it in a manner that is passive to where you make a point. But remember those sit-in pictures? Who looked bad in those sit-in pictures? The white people, right? So with that, that is what Martin Luther King Jr. is going to do unbelievably well. And it's, in my opinion, the key reason why a lot of the civil rights basically is successful during this time. Now, there is one thing that you need to make sure that you know that happened during this time period, and it actually is Martin Luther King Jr. He was protesting in Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, Birmingham, Alabama. That's where this happens. And he is arrested and he is thrown in jail. Man, there is so much stuff I could tell you that happened to Martin Luther King Jr. His house would be bombed. All this kind of stuff is going to happen. But when he is arrested this one time, he is sitting in the Birmingham jail and he writes a letter. And the letter is actually in response. And this is something I want to make sure you get. He wrote this letter after being arrested for a peaceful protest. But this letter is in response actually to a letter that was sent to him by 8 clergymen that called for a call for unity. I want you to circle this part right here, a call for unity. They actually told Martin Luther King Jr., you need to stop protesting. We can get civil rights, but if you protest, it's going to cause more problems. And he basically writes back, and you're going to be reading a section of this letter. It's gonna be an assignment. And he basically says, I will not cease and desist. I will protest. It will be in a passive manner, in a polite manner, in a legal manner. But he says, I'm not going to drop this. The men recognized that more injustices were occurring in Birmingham, but they didn't think that the battle should be on the streets like Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. They thought it should be fought in the courtroom. And King responds basically and says, it needs to happen in the streets, in the courtroom, in the press, in the Washington, D.C. He says this is a fight that needs to go everywhere. So you need to know about that letter. And like I said, we will be reading that letter too. There's a couple more things you need to know that happened in the 1960s. The one big thing that I really want you to do is pause this and get this down. What were freedom riders? So go ahead and pause this and when it was and all that kind of good stuff. All right, so the civil rights movement. In May of 1961, a group of civil rights activists boarded buses bound for southern cities that had to test a law that had prohibited segregation in interstate transportation facilities. During these summers, 1961 to 64, all these activists board buses because there had been this law that was put in place actually to end segregation on buses. We know this, of course. This is where the Montgomery bus boycott came from. And Rosa Parks sits on the wrong part of the bus and then gets arrested. And that's literally where all this comes from. But the Freedom Riders actually were testing a law that said that it was just okay for African Americans and whites to go state to state, okay? With that, the whole point of it, and you can kind of see with this map right here, They start in Washington, D.C., and these buses were supposed to go, and they were being covered by the press, so the African Americans were huge targets because they were rolling into Montgomery and Jackson and Nashville. And they knew that whites and blacks were on this bus. Yes, white people did this as well. They were standing up for civil rights. And this was going to be a very big problem for a lot of Southern white people, that African Americans and whites were kind of define their culture this way. And so, as you'll see with some of these pictures, many white people were waiting for the Freedom Riders, and they actually bombed their buses, set them on fire, did roadblocks. The Freedom Riders actually themselves, many of them are hurt, dramatically hurt. You can see this picture. We're going to watch a little video in class on the Freedom Riders. But this whole protest, again, it's civil disobedience. Are these people riding these buses, and you'll notice all white right here, okay? Are these people actually breaking the law? No, the law says they can ride on the bus. It was the whites in the South that said, no, you shouldn't. So they are passively, civilly disobeying the culture, and the Freedom Riders would become a massive source of, if you will, tension for the South. In fact, so much so, this is the next slide, the Freedom Rides, and I know this has a lot of writing on it, so why don't you pause it real quick and get down what you're supposed to get down, which is this Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Ooh, Kennedy. Get that down for a second. Pause it. Okay, so the Freedom Riders, like I said, 60s are going to be going down into the South to test that. The purpose of the Freedom Riders, go ahead and get ready to circle right here. This Supreme Court case basically expanded the earlier ban on bus segregation, so it then includes bus stations and restaurants that served interstate travelers. The Interstate Commerce Commission is going to come into play here. That's something actually a long time ago that we talked about. A little bit progressive area right there to kind of bust up some trust. But with that, actually, they're going to say if you're serving interstate commerce, you can't segregate. The Interstate Commerce Commission is going to be a major tool that the federal government uses to combat segregation. So in 1961, literally the Southern leadership, the African Americans in the South, they organized the Freedom Rides to test these Southern compliances with this ruling of this court case, Boynton versus Virginia. Now, violence greets the riders, although the readers expected confrontation, etc. They had no idea what was coming, a heavily armed white mob, some of these pictures. And so it needs government action, which is where a really cool part of this story comes in. Guess who is the Attorney General of the United States? A guy named Robert Kennedy, oftentimes known, here's a good quiz question, as Bobby. Bobby Kennedy is actually JFK's younger brother, and a lot of people were kind of a little bit like taboo about the fact that Kennedy gave the Attorney General spot to his brother, but he said literally he's the best man for the job. Remember, Attorney General is kind of like the head policeman, law and order guy of the country, and Kennedy, JFK himself, he was a debonair. I mean, he was great with the press, and he joked, I thought I'd give him some experience. And the press just laughed it off, and everybody loved Kennedy, him and his wife, Camelot, the picture family. Okay, the fairy tale family, and so they didn't question it. Robert Kennedy had originally been opposed to lending federal troops to these Freedom Riders. However, he later, I need you to star this, sent in federal troops to protect the riders. He also pressured the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, to prohibit all interstate transportation, segregation in all interstate transportation, and the Justice Department to begin to kind of fight that a little bit. But Bobby Kennedy, JFK's brother, is the one who basically sends a bunch of troops to protect these Freedom Riders. So did JFK stand up for African Americans? You better believe he did. And so did his brother, Bobby. James Meredith and integration at Ole Miss. Go ahead and pause this. This is going to kind of be the Little Rock Nine, but like college style. Pause it. Get it down. Okay, so James Meredith, the first ever African American to attend Ole Miss. That's right, University of Mississippi, in 1962. He is an African American Air Force veteran that was denied admission to the University of Mississippi, also known as Ole Miss. When federal marshals literally had to accompany Meredith to campus to register for classes, rioting erupted and many people were injured, including 2 people died. President Kennedy said this is crap. Brown versus Board of Education has basically been on the books for 10 years now. He will be attending Ole Miss, and I will mobilize, this is what you wrote down, Underline, Kennedy mobilized the National Guard and sent in federal troops to protect Meredith. Literally, Meredith becomes the very first graduate of Ole Miss. Here is African-American graduate. Here he is right here, being escorted to class by military police right there. And here he is right now as a proud alumni of Ole Miss. But unfortunately, there was not entirely happy people about it. Kind of like what city? Little Rock 9. Welcome to Ole Miss. And then it says white students. So kind of a little bit of a tense moment. But did JFK kind of man up like Eisenhower did and send in some troops? So that's good. There's one more university we need to talk about for civil rights movement, and that is the University of Alabama. Now, go ahead and pause this and get it down. This one's a pretty important one, I'll be honest with you, as well as it's in Forrest Gump. Okay, hope you paused it. Make sure you're getting this stuff down and listening. Alabama Governor George Wallace, circle that name. George Wallace, huge, big-time deal. George Wallace, he's going to go ahead and run for president later, and he's kind of crappy because listen to his quote, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Yes, that's right. George Wallace is basically a jerk. He's a segregationist, and he is definitely not a civil rights activist. In June of 1963, he upheld his promise. He had said, if you try and send Negro students, and he probably didn't say Negro students, into the University of Alabama, I will stand at the door to prevent them from coming in. So literally, 2 female black students enroll at University of Alabama, and literally Wallace, here he is standing in the door, and Alabama Guard literally is federalized, and literally JFK says, what does the South think they are doing to protect the students? Again, President Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard, and on June 11th, the president addressed the nation and basically said, look, you are going to treat them like human beings, and it is a federal law that states they can go to your school. George Wallace goes on TV, oh my gosh, look at this picture right here, standing in front of the Confederate flag, and basically says, no, I'm not going to back down, but Kennedy mobilized the troops, so there wasn't much he could do. George Wallace, like I said, will literally run for president. He'll be shot in the back. People didn't like him. I wonder why. Last thing for civil rights, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't probably even need to teach it. It's literally August of 1963, okay? Literally about 3/4 of the way into the civil rights movement, and there is another way of civil disobedience that actually is going to be extremely effective that Martin Luther King Jr. and many of the civil rights are going to advocate through, and it is called a march, okay? And in fact, one thing I want to make sure you just add to your list of civil disobedient ways of protesting is marching. On August 1963, Civil Rights March, okay, Martin Luther King Jr. marches. It's actually called the Million Man March as well, considered to be one of the biggest marches. More than 200,000 Americans of all kinds of different groups are going to march on the centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation for Washington. It's called the March on Washington. And at the end of that march, he gives possibly the most famous speech in American history. In fact, I know you know it. I have a dream. And this is the view that he gets of that I have a dream speech. And literally, it will cap off the entire civil rights movement. Here is just a very small clip of that I have a dream speech. We're going to watch it a little bit in class, but unbelievably good speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down
He sure did. I wonder if he'd be proud of us today. Okay, tune in for part 3.